A word before we begin. There's a kind of story that settles into your bones, like the smell of bread baking on a Sunday morning, not the flashy kind with gunfights and desperados, but the quieter sort about ordinary folks finding their way through hard times. This is one of those stories. It's about a young woman named Clara Whitmore, who traveled halfway across this great country on nothing but hope and a stranger's promise. It's about what happens when that promise turns to dust, and what she discovers in the aftermath. I've always believed that the truest courage isn't the loud kind. It's the woman who gets up every morning when she has every reason to stay in bed. It's the choice to keep going when the road ahead looks darker than a moonless night. My grandmother used to say, "The Lord doesn't give us burdens we can't carry. He just sometimes waits to show us how strong we really are." So settle in, pour yourself some coffee, and let me tell you about Clara and about the September afternoon that changed everything. The lie had eaten through the skin between Clara's fingers again. She noticed it the way she noticed most things now, distantly, like watching someone else's hands wring out Mrs. Hensley's bed linens in the copper wash tub. The water had gone gray hours ago, smelling of sweat and soap and other people's living. Her knuckles cracked each time she twisted the fabric, small red lines opening where the harsh soap had done its work. 11 hours. That's how long she'd been standing in the boarding house's backyard, working through sheets and pillowcases and tablecloths stained with coffee and tobacco. The September sun had moved from her left shoulder to her right, and now it hung low over the cedar breaks west of town, painting the sky in shades of amber and dusty rose. Back in Pennsylvania, her mother would be starting supper right about now. Clara could almost smell it, onions frying in the cast-iron skillet, the yeasty warmth of bread dough rising near the stove, coffee percolating in the old tin pot that had belonged to Grandma Whitmore. But that was 2,000 miles away, another lifetime. Clara lifted the last sheet from the water, wrung it out, draped it over the line with the others, where they hung like tired ghosts in the fading light. "You finished." Mrs. Hensley stood on the back porch, wiping her hands on her apron. A thin woman with thin lips and eyes that calculated everything down to the last penny. "Yes, ma'am." "Took you long enough." "I reckon." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. She'd done the work of two women because Mrs. Hensley's regular girl had run off with a cattle buyer last week, and because Clara needed the 50 cents more than she needed pride. Her mother's voice drifted through her memory. "Pride won't fill an empty belly, child, but it'll sure enough keep you warm when nothing else will." Mrs. Hensley descended the porch steps, inspecting the lines of drying laundry with pursed lips. She ran her fingers along a pillowcase, checking for dampness, for stains, for any excuse to dock the pay, finding none. She reached into her apron pocket and produced 2 quarters, dropped them into Clara's palm without touching her skin. "There's a biscuit in the kitchen. Day old, but it's yours if you want it." "Thank you kindly, ma'am." Clara pocketed the coins, collected the biscuit wrapped in a scrap of cloth that had seen better days, and walked around the side of the house to the street, somewhere across town. The Methodist church bell rang 6 times. The sound carried through the evening air, mixing with the smell of wood smoke from supper fires and the distant laughter of children being called in from play. A dog barked. A wagon creaked past, its driver tipping his hat to no one in particular. The town of Cedar Mills stretched before her in the amber light, a single main street of packed dirt. A general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church with a bell tower that had just finished its evening song. 53 buildings, if you counted the outhouses. Clara had counted. She'd had time. 3 weeks. That's how long she'd been here. 3 weeks since she'd stepped off the stage with her trunk and her hope and her certainty that Harold J. Finch would be waiting for her. She walked past the general store. 2 women stood on this wooden sidewalk outside Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Doyle. If Clara remembered right, their conversation stopping dead the moment Clara came into view. She felt their eyes on her back as she passed, heard the whisper that followed, carried on the cooling breeze. That's the one. Got left at the station like a parcel nobody wanted. Clara kept walking. Her feet knew the way now down the main street, past the blacksmith's forge with its dying coals, around the back of the livery stable to the shed that old Tom let her use in exchange for mucking out stalls every third morning. The shed had been a tack room once. It still smelled of leather and horse sweat, and the ghosts of saddles long since sold. Clara had made it hers as best she could, a horse blanket folded on the dirt floor for sleeping, her trunk pushed against the wall, a cracked mirror propped in the corner so she could make herself presentable for work. She set the biscuit on the trunk, sat down beside it. The light through the gaps in the wooden slats was fading now, turning from gold to purple to the deep blue of coming night. A cricket started up somewhere nearby, then another, the sounds of a Texas evening settling in around her. Clara reached into her apron pocket, past the 2 quarters, past the scrap of cloth, and pulled out the paper she'd carried with her every day since Pennsylvania, the marriage certificate. She unfolded it carefully, though the creases were so worn now that the paper threatened to separate along them. The ink was still legible in the dying light, the county seal still visible in the corner, and there, at the bottom, 2 signatures. Hers, Clara Ann Whitmore, written in the careful hand her mother had taught her at the kitchen table. Back when life made sense, his Harold J. Finch, a confident scrawl she'd never seen made, only received 6 months of letters. That's how it had started. An advertisement in a Pennsylvania newspaper. Respectable farmer, seeks wife. Must be willing to work. Good Christian woman preferred. Send correspondence to H.J. Finch, Cedar Mill, Texas. She'd written back that same evening, her heart pounding with something that felt like possibility. He'd replied 2 weeks later, a letter full of detail about the farm, the house he was building, the apple trees he planned to plant come spring. His words had painted pictures in her mind. A porch with a rocking chair, a garden out back, children, someday, playing in the yard. He'd sent her $40 for the train ticket, sent her the marriage certificate, already signed on his end, a promise made legal before she ever left home. Come to Cedar Mill. His last letter had said, I'll be waiting at the station. We'll start our life together. Clara traced his signature with her thumb. The ink didn't smudge anymore. It had set long ago. 3 weeks. No one in Cedar Mill had ever heard of Harold J. Finch. No farm, no house, no apple trees. Just a name on a paper, and $40 she'd spent getting here. She folded the certificate, smaller this time, tucked it deep into her apron pocket, past the quarters, past the biscuit, into the darkness where she didn't have to look at it. Her grandmother's voice came to her, unbidden. When the Lord closes a door, child, he opens a window. You just got to be brave enough to climb through. Clara looked around the shed, at the cracked mirror, at the horse blanket, at the trunk that held everything she owned in this world. She hadn't found the window yet, but tomorrow she'd ask about work at the hotel. Tonight she'd eat half the biscuit, save the other half for morning, and say her prayers the way Mama taught her, and she would not cry. Crying had stopped working weeks ago. End of part 1 word. Count 1 420. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The feverfew grew thick along Cypress Creek, clusters of white flowers nodding in the late afternoon breeze. Clara worked her way along the bank, her gathering basket half full. Mr. Pruitt at the apothecary paid 10 cents for a good bundle of dried feverfew, 5 cents for yarrow. Not much, but enough to stretch the day's wages into something resembling a meal. The creek water ran clear over limestone, catching the copper light that filtered through the cypress trees. Somewhere upstream, a mockingbird sang its evening song. The air smelled of wet stone and wild sage, and the particular sweetness of Texas autumn. Clara spotted a patch of yarrow further upstream, near a bend where the limestone shelved out over the water. She climbed over a tangle of exposed roots, her worn boots slipping on the damp earth, reached for the yarrow, stopped. A horse stood in the shallows 20 feet away, a chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead, her coat gleaming like polished copper in the dying light. Silver conchos caught the sun on the saddle, real silver, not tin. The reins dragged in the water, dark leather trailing like something forgotten. No rider. Clara's hand tightened on her basket. A riderless horse meant trouble. Her father used to say that. A horse without a man means the man's found trouble, or trouble's found him. She should turn around, walk back to town, tell the sheriff, let him sort it out. The mare raised her head, snorted once, went back to drinking. Clara's eyes followed the line of bent grass along the bank, saw the boot, first good leather, worn at the heel but expensive once, then the leg, then the man, face down at the water's edge, one arm stretched toward the creek like he'd been reaching for a drink he never got. Her breath caught. She moved without deciding to, basket forgotten, feet sliding on the limestone. The smell hit her as she drew close, copper and dirt and something raw. Blood. A lot of it. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, grabbed his shoulder, rolled him onto his back. A man. Late 30s. Maybe 40. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that might have been handsome before pain twisted it into a grimace. His shirt was soaked through on the right side, fabric torn, blood still seeping. She pulled the cloth aside. A gash ran along his ribs, deep, jagged, edges white where they'd pulled apart. His chest rose, barely. A wet, shallow breath, alive, but fading fast. Clara looked at the horse, at the silver conchos, at the fine wool coat bunched beneath him. This man had money, real money, and she had 8 cents to her name. To be continued. Yes. Clara's hands moved before her mind caught up. She tore strips from her petticoat, the good one, the one she'd been saving for church, if she ever found one that would have her. The cotton ripped clean, white against the blood on her fingers. She pressed the wadded fabric against the gash in his side, leaning her weight into it the way Mama had shown her years ago when Papa cut his leg on the plow blade. The man groaned. His eyes stayed closed. "Don't you quit on me," Clara muttered. "I'm not fixing to haul a corpse back to town." The bleeding slowed under the pressure. Not stopped, but slowed. She needed to get him somewhere she could work somewhere with water and light and her mother's sewing kit. Clara looked at the mare, looked at the man, looked at the distance between them and calculated the weight. She couldn't lift him. 160 pounds, maybe more, of dead weight. Her back would give out before she got him 3 feet off the ground. But she could drag him. The saddle blanket came free with a hard tug. Wool, thick, large enough to hold a man. Clara spread it on the ground beside him, then rolled him onto it one push at a time, keeping pressure on the wound with her knee when her hands were busy. His head lolled. His breath rattled. The reins. She needed the reins. Clara caught the mare's bridle, spoke soft words until the animal steadied. Her grandmother had always said horses could smell fear, could sense when a body was troubled. This one seemed to understand something was wrong. She tied the ends of the blanket to the saddle horn, fashioning a crude travois like the drawings she'd seen in her father's old almanac. "Walk on," she told the horse. "Slow now. Easy." The mare stepped forward, and the blanket slid across the grass, the man's weight dragging behind. Clara walked alongside, one hand pressed to his wound, the other gripping the bridle. The light was failing. The sky had turned from copper to purple, and the first stars were beginning to show over the eastern hills. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, a lonesome sound that made Clara think of all the miles between here and home. She took the back way into town. The shed door scraped against the dirt floor as Clara shouldered it open. Getting him inside took everything she had left. The travois wouldn't fit through the doorway. She had to unhook it, grab the blanket's edges, and pull. Her arms burned. Her back screamed. His boots scraped furrows in the packed earth, and his head bumped against the threshold with a sound that made her wince. But she got him inside, got him onto the horse blanket that served as her bed, got the door closed behind her. Clara stood there in the darkness, breathing hard, sweat cooling on her neck despite the evening chill. Outside, the cricket chorus had started up, filling the night with their endless song. The mare. She'd nearly forgotten. Clara slipped back out, led the horse around to the back of the shed where the shadows were deepest, tied her to a fence post, removed the saddle, gave her water from the trough behind the livery. The street beyond was empty. Cedar Mill had settled into its evening routines, lamplight glowing in windows, the faint sound of a fiddle from the saloon, the smell of bacon frying in someone's kitchen. No one had seen. Clara went back inside. The coal oil lamp took 3 matches to light. Her hands were trembling now, the shakes setting in as the urgency faded. She filled her copper kettle from the water bucket, set it on the small stove, waited for the flame to catch and hold. The man lay where she'd left him, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His face was pale beneath the weathering, lips going gray. Fever was coming. She could see it in the sweat beading on his forehead, feel it in the heat that rose from his skin when she pressed her palm to his cheek. Lord, she prayed silently, I don't know who this man is or why you put him in my path, but I reckon you had your reasons. Help me do right by him. The water boiled. Clara poured some into her tin basin, let it cool enough to touch. She knelt beside him and cut away his shirt with her sewing scissors, good wool, ruined now, soaked through with blood and creek water. The wound looked worse in the lamplight, a jagged tear along his ribs, 4 inches long, the edges ragged where limestone had ripped through flesh, deep enough to see the pink of muscle beneath. But no bone showing, no organs. He'd been lucky, if you could call it that. Clara cleaned the wound with boiled water and a clean rag. The man's body jerked, a sound escaping his throat that wasn't quite a word. She pressed on, steady, thorough. Her mother's voice guided her hands. Infection's what kills. Clara girl, clean it good, even when they holler. The yarrow from her basket. She crushed the leaves between her fingers, mixed them with a little water to make a paste, packed it into the gash the way she'd seen her mother do 100 times back home, then bandages strips of her ruined petticoat, wrapped tight around his torso. When she finished, her hands were steady again. The work had settled her, the way it always did. She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the lamplight. His coat lay bundled in the corner where she'd tossed it. Fine wool, mother of pearl buttons. The kind of coat a man wore when he wanted folks to know he'd made something of himself. Clara reached for it, found the inside pocket. A wallet, leather, soft with age. $17 in paper currency, more money than she'd held in her hands since leaving Pennsylvania. And a photograph, a daguerreotype in a small leather case. A woman's face stared back at her, handsome rather than pretty, with serious eyes and gray hair pulled back tight. Clara put the wallet back, tucked it into the coat, set the coat aside. She didn't take a cent. The fever came hard around midnight. He burned under her hands, his skin dry and hot, his breath coming fast and shallow. He muttered words that didn't connect fragments of a life she didn't know. The north pasture. Samuel. Tell Samuel. Clara wrung out a cloth in cool water, pressed it to his forehead. The lamp flame guttered in a draft from the poorly fitted door. Outside. An owl called a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The bay mare threw a shoe. Need to check the... She changed the compress, counted his breaths, listened to the night sounds that drifted through the cracks in the walls, the crickets, the owl, the distant yip of coyotes hunting in the hills. The hours crawled past. Clara's eyes grew heavy, but she didn't dare sleep. Every time she started to drift, she thought of her mother sitting up with Papa that winter he'd taken pneumonia. 3 nights straight, Mama had sat in that chair, not sleeping, just watching, praying, waiting. "You don't leave folks alone in the dark," her mother had said. "That's when the dying comes for them." So Clara stayed, somewhere past 2 in the morning. The man's eyes opened. They were unfocused, fever bright. Seeing something that wasn't there, he looked right at her through her, and his cracked lips moved. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Clara's hand stilled on his forehead. Sarah. Not her. Someone else. Someone he'd lost. "Hush now," she said quietly. "You're safe. Rest." His eyes closed. The tension went out of his body. He slipped back into whatever darkness the fever had made for him. Clara sat beside him as the night stretched on, watching his face in the flickering lamplight, wondering who Sarah was, and wondering if she was still alive. To be continued. Dawn came gray and slow through the cracks in the shed walls. Clara had dozed off sometime in the small hours, her back against the rough wood, her hand still resting near the stranger's shoulder. She woke to the sound of roosters crowing across town and the pale light of morning creeping into her little shelter. The man was still breathing. She checked the bandage first the bleeding had stopped. The yarrow poultice doing its work. His fever had dropped too, not gone but lower, and some color had come back to his face. He looked less like a corpse now, and more like a man who'd had a hard night and might yet see another day. Clara stretched the stiffness from her neck and shoulders. Her whole body ached from sleeping upright, and her stomach had begun making noises that reminded her she hadn't eaten since that half biscuit yesterday evening. She left water in this tin cup, placed it within his reach, checked the door, checked the window. Then she counted her money. 2 quarters from Mrs. Hensley. 2 dimes saved from last week. 3 pennies she'd found in the street outside the saloon. 73 cents. The man needed medicine. Real medicine, not creek bank remedies. Carbolic acid to fight the infection that would surely come. Laudanum for the pain that would hit him hard once he was fully awake. Clara knew what those cost. She'd priced them 3 days ago when her own hands cracked and bled from the lye soap. She gathered the coins into her palm, tucked them into her apron pocket, whispered a prayer that the Lord would watch over this stranger while she was gone. Then she slipped out into the morning. The apothecary smelled of camphor and dust and something bitter underneath medicine smells. Her mother would have called them. Mr. Pruitt stood behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles perched on a nose that seemed too small for his face. Glass jars lined the shelves behind him, amber and green and clear, filled with powders and liquids and things Clara couldn't name. Morning light filtered through the dusty front window, falling in pale squares across the worn wooden floor. She approached the counter. Her boots sounded loud in the quiet. "Miss Whitmore." Mr. Pruitt's voice carried no warmth, but no judgment either, just acknowledgement of a fact. "You're out early this morning." "Yes, sir. I'm needing some carbolic acid and laudanum. If you have it, small bottles of each." His eyebrows lifted a fraction behind those thick spectacles. "That's a particular combination, treating something serious." Clara kept her face still. She'd learned that trick from watching her mother deal with nosy neighbors back home. "Found a drifter out by the creek yesterday evening. Took a bad fall. Looks like... Figured Christian charity called for doing what I could." A drifter. Mr. Pruitt reached for the jars on the shelf behind him. His movements were slow, deliberate, the way old men moved when they were thinking hard about something. The charitable thing would be to bring him to Dr. Hammond. "I reckon. Dr. Hammond charges $2 just to look at a man. I've got 73 cents to my name. Mr. Pruitt paused, his hand on a brown glass bottle. Something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. Carbolic acid, 25 cents. Laudanum, 40. He set both bottles on the counter between them. That's 65 total. Clara reached into her apron pocket, drew out the coins, laid them on the worn wood one by one, her fingers separating each piece the way her mother had taught her to count money careful, precise, respectful of every cent. 2 quarters, side by side, 2 dimes, below them, 3 pennies. In a row at the bottom, 8 cents would be left. 8 cents between her and nothing at all. She slid 65 cents across the counter. Mr. Pruitt swept them into his hand, dropped them into the till with a small rattle. He wrapped the bottles in brown paper, tied the package with string from a spool that looked older than Clara herself. Neither of them spoke. Clara took the package, turned toward the door. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. Christian charity is a fine thing. Mr. Pruitt's voice was careful, measured. But a woman alone ought to be cautious about who she takes in. There's folks in this world who'd take advantage of a kind heart. Clara looked at him over her shoulder. I'm always cautious. Mr. Pruitt learned that lesson the hard way. She walked out into the morning sun, the little package clutched against her chest like something precious. The shed door stuck on its hinges when she pushed it open. The smell hit her first sweat and blood in the close air of a space too small for secrets. Then movement, a sound, the scrape of fabric against wood. He was sitting up. The stranger had pushed himself against the wall, his face gray with the effort, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. His eyes were open clear now. The fever haze burned away and fixed on the door. On her. Clara froze in the threshold. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Morning light fell between them, bright and sharp with floating dust. Where am I? His voice came out rough, scraped raw like he'd been gargling gravel. He swallowed. Tried again. What is this place? Clara stepped inside, closed the door behind her. My place, such as it is. Edge of town. Behind the livery. Your place. His gaze traveled the small space, the horse blanket on the dirt floor, the cracked mirror in the corner, the trunk that held everything she owned. Something flickered in his eyes. Understanding. Maybe. Or surprise. Who are you? He asked. Clara Whitmore. She set the package on the trunk, began unwrapping it. Her movements deliberate, giving her hands something to do. Who are you? A pause. She felt him weighing the question, deciding what to give. Ethan. Clara looked up. Just Ethan. Another pause, longer this time. His jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath the stubble. Just Ethan. For now. She held his gaze for 3 heartbeats, then turned back to the package, pulling out the bottles, setting them in a row on the trunk lid. Well, just Ethan. You were in a bad way when I found you. Gash along your ribs deep, but clean enough. I don't reckon any organs got hit. You lost considerable blood. Though, how long have I been here? Since yesterday afternoon. Your fever broke a few hours back. Ethan looked down at the bandages wrapped around his torso, touched them gingerly with his fingertips. Winced. You did this, the bandaging. My mother was a midwife back in Pennsylvania. She taught me enough to be useful. He raised his eyes to hers again. Something in his expression had shifted surprise, maybe, or reassessment. Clara wasn't sure she cared which. I can pay you, he said, for the trouble, for the medicine. Clara's jaw tightened. She reached for the tin cup, filled it from the water bucket, held it out to him. I didn't ask for payment. I know. He took the cup. Their fingers didn't touch. That's why I'm offering. Drink that. You need fluids. The fever took a lot out of you. He drank. She watched his throat work, watched the way his hand trembled slightly holding the cup. Weaker than he wanted to show. Hurting more than he'd admit. When the cup was empty, she took it back, refilled it, set it within his reach on the dirt floor. The carbolic acid needs to go on the wound. It'll sting something fierce. I've had worse. I doubt that considerable. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite make it to his eyes. Clara knelt beside him, unwrapping the bandages with careful hands. The wound looked better than she'd feared, still angry, still raw, but the edges had started to close. No red streaks running away from it, no smell of rot. She uncapped the carbolic acid, poured it onto a clean cloth. Ready. Ethan gripped the horse blanket beneath him. Go ahead. She pressed the cloth to the wound. His whole body went rigid. The tendons in his neck stood out like ropes, and a sound escaped through his clenched teeth that wasn't quite a groan, but he didn't pull away, didn't cry out. Clara counted to 10, lifted the cloth, applied fresh bandages, wrapping them tight. Done. Ethan released a breath he'd been holding. His face had gone gray again, sheened with fresh sweat. Thank you. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, rose to her feet. There's broth warming on the stove. Bone broth, not much, but it'll help build your strength back. You've done enough already, more than enough. I'll be the judge of that. She moved to the coal oil stove, where a small pot sat over a low flame. The broth was thin bones begged from the butcher behind the hotel, boiled down with a little salt, but it was hot and nourishing. She ladled some into a tin bowl, carried it to him, pressed it into his hands before he could refuse. Ethan looked at the bowl, at her, at the shed around them. Why? He asked quietly. You don't know me. You don't owe me a blessed thing. Why help? Clara stood over him, arms crossed. I found you dying in a creek. Didn't seem right to leave you there. Some folks would have. I ain't some folks. She turned away, busied herself with the medicine bottles, gave him privacy to eat. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of him drinking the broth, the tin bowl settling on the dirt floor, then his voice, quieter than before. The coat. My wallet's in the inside pocket. Clara stiffened. You looked through it. I know you did. Anyone would. A pause. But the money's still there. All $17. She didn't turn around. Her hands stayed busy arranging bottles that didn't need arranging. I'm not a thief. Mr. Ethan. I know. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Another pause. Longer. Thank you. For that, too. Clara finally looked at him. He was watching her with those tired eyes, the bowl empty in his lap. Get some rest, she said. The laudanum will help with the pain, but sleep will do more. She measured out a careful dose into the tin cup, handed it to him. Ethan drank it without argument, settled back against the wall, his eyes already growing heavy. Clara Whitmore, he murmured. I won't forget that name. You do that. She watched him drift into drugged sleep, his breathing evening out, the lines of pain softening in his face. Then she sat down on her trunk and counted what remained. 8 cents. A half-full bottle of carbolic acid. A stranger who owed her his life and offered money she wouldn't take. And somewhere out there, someone named Samuel was waiting for news of a man who'd never come home. To be continued. 3 days changed the rhythm of Clara's life. She measured time now by the changing of bandages, the warming of broth, the slow return of color to the stranger's face. 3 days of sharing a space built for one, of learning when he slept and when he woke, of conversations that circled around the things neither of them said. On the morning of the third day, Ethan sat up without help. Clara watched from the doorway, a steaming bowl in her hands, as he pushed himself upright against the wall. His jaw clenched tight. The muscles in his arms trembled with the effort. But he made it. And when he was settled, he looked at her with something in his eyes that wasn't quite pride but lived close by. "Getting stronger," she said. "Slower than I'd like. You had a hole in your side 3 days ago. Slow is how it's supposed to go." She crossed the small space, handed him the bowl. "My grandmother used to say, 'The Lord didn't make oak trees in a day, and he won't mend a stubborn man any faster.'" Ethan took the bowl. His hands were steadier today. No tremor when he lifted it to his lips. Bone broth again. "It's what I've got. You want fancy, you'll have to find yourself a hotel." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "This is fine. Better than fine." Clara moved to the corner where she'd piled the dirty bandages, began sorting them for washing. Some could be boiled clean and used again. Others were too far gone, stiff with dried blood that had turned the color of rust. Outside, she could hear Cedar Mill coming awake, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against iron, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Children's voices raised in some game or argument. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life going on while she hid a stranger in her shed. "Where'd you learn to make broth like this?" Ethan asked between sips. "Nowhere special. You learn or you go hungry." That a Pennsylvania philosophy. Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. She looked at him over her shoulder. "How'd you know I'm from Pennsylvania?" "Your accent. The way you flatten certain words. And you mentioned your mother was a midwife back there." He set the empty bowl aside. "I've done business with men from Pittsburgh. They talk the same way. Business." The word hung in the air like smoke. Clara filed it away with the other clues: the fine coat, the silver conchos, the $17 he carried like pocket change. "Allentown," she said, turning back to the bandages. "Small town north of Philadelphia. Coal country, though my people weren't miners. My father farmed what land we had. My mother delivered babies and tended the sick." "What brought you all the way to Texas?" The question landed soft, but Clara felt its weight. She folded a bandage, set it aside, reached for another. "A man." Silence from behind her. Then, the one who never showed. "You were awake for that." "I was awake for a lot of things. Fever doesn't always mean a body can't hear." Clara's fingers pressed hard into the fabric. She thought of the words she'd muttered in the dark, thinking he couldn't hear. The frustrations she'd let slip when she thought she was alone. His name was Harold Finch. The words came out flat, the way she'd practiced saying them, so they wouldn't crack. "Harold J. Finch. We wrote letters for 6 months. Started when I answered an advertisement in the newspaper. Fold, set aside, reach. He wrote nice letters, real nice. Said he had a farm outside of town. Said he was building a house with his own 2 hands. Said he wanted a wife who wasn't afraid of work and wasn't looking for fancy things." Her hands kept moving. Fold, set aside, reach. The rhythm steadied her, gave her something to hold on to. "He sent me $40 for the train ticket. That was more money than I'd seen at one time in my whole life. And he sent me a marriage certificate, already signed on his end. Said it would make things proper when I arrived." The last bandage. Clara folded it with care, smoothing every crease. "I sold everything I owned. Quit my job at the textile mill. Said goodbye to neighbors I'd known since I was in pinafores." She paused. Her throat felt tight, but she pushed through. "Got on a train and rode for 4 days, watching the country change outside the window, thinking about apple trees, about a garden out back. About children someday. She turned to face him. He wasn't there. When I stepped off that stage, there was no one waiting. No Harold Finch. No farm. No house. Nobody in Cedar Mill had ever heard of him. Her voice stayed level, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. Either he never existed at all, or he took one look at me getting off that stage and decided he'd made a mistake. I reckon I'll never know which. Ethan had stopped eating. The bowl sat forgotten on the dirt floor beside him. How long ago? His voice was quiet. 3 weeks come Sunday. And you've been here since... in this shed. Old Tom lets me use it for mucking out his stalls. I take in laundry when folks will hire me. It's not much, but it's honest work, and it's mine. She waited for what usually came next, the head tilt of pity, the clicking of the tongue, the offer of hollow comfort. She'd gotten good at bracing for it. But Ethan just looked at her, really looked, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. What do you figure to do? He asked finally. Work, save what I can, move on eventually, I suppose. Find somewhere folks don't know I got left at the station like a trunk nobody came to claim. The words came out harder than she meant. A thin smile followed, not humor. Exactly, but something that wore the same clothes. The kind of smile you learned to put on when the alternative was letting people see you cry. My mama used to say, "The Lord doesn't waste pain, Clara girl. Everything hard we go through, He uses to make us ready for what comes next." She shrugged. I'm still waiting to see what that might be. Ethan didn't smile back. His eyes traveled the shed, the horse blanket she'd given up for him, the cracked mirror, the trunk with its tarnished corners, taking inventory of her life, measuring its size. You spent your last money on medicine for me, he said. Not a question. Clara didn't answer. The carbolic acid, the laudanum. You came back from the apothecary with nothing else. No food for yourself. No supplies. Just the medicine I needed. You were hurting. You didn't even know my name. What difference does a name make? Clara uncrossed her arms. You were dying. I could help. That's what decent folks do. Ethan was quiet for a long spell. He picked up the bowl again but didn't drink from it. Just held it, turning it in his hands like he was looking for something written on its surface. I have a ranch, he said finally. North of here, cattle operation, mostly. Clara's hand stilled. 12,000 acres, 500 head, 20 men on the payroll, give or take. The number hung in the air. 12,000 acres. Clara thought of the $17 in his wallet, thought of the silver conchos on his saddle, thought of the bone broth she'd been feeding him, made from scraps the butcher threw out for dogs. I rode out 4 days ago to check the north pasture, alone. His jaw tightened. Foolish habit, my foreman tells me so every time. The mare spooked at something, threw me into the rocks. After that, things go hazy. 12,000 acres. Clara's mouth had gone dry. So when you said, just Ethan, I meant Ethan Caldwell. He met her eyes. The Caldwell, if you believe what folks say, though I generally don't put much stock in what folks say. The shed felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. Clara was aware of every crack in the wood, every patch on her dress, every callus on her work-worn hands. Why didn't you tell me straight off? Because you didn't ask. Because you looked at me and saw a man who needed help, not a rancher with a name and a bank account. His voice dropped. Do you have any notion how rare that is to have somebody see you plain, without all the rest of it getting in the way? Clara stared at him. Outside, the church bell began to ring noon already. The day half gone while she stood here having her world turned sideways. I saw $17 in your wallet, she said slowly. That's not just a man. And you didn't take it, not 1 cent. The words landed between them like something heavy dropped from a height. I told you before. I'm not a thief. I know. That's what I keep trying to say. He leaned forward, wincing at the pull in his side. In 38 years of living, I've met a considerable number of people who wanted something from me. Money, favors, connections to the right folks. You're the first person in longer than I can remember who wanted nothing but to see me breathing. Clara didn't know what to say to that. Her mouth opened, closed. She turned away, busying herself with the coal oil stove, checking a flame that didn't need checking. It doesn't change anything, she said. You still needed help. I still gave it. That's all there is to it. It changes everything. She heard him shift behind her, the rustle of the blanket, a sharp intake of breath as the movement pulled at his wound. Clara, she didn't turn around. I'm going to find a way to repay what you've done. Not with money I can see plain enough that won't work, but somehow, some way that matters. Clara stared at the stove flame, watched it dance behind the sooty glass. Get some rest, Mr. Caldwell. You're still healing. Ethan. Mr. Caldwell. A pause. Then, soft as a sigh. Fair enough, for now. She heard him settle back against the wall, heard his breathing slow as the laudanum she'd given him earlier pulled him toward sleep. Only when she was certain he was unconscious did Clara allow herself to sit. She lowered herself onto the trunk, her legs suddenly unsteady, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. 12,000 acres. The richest rancher in 3 counties. Maybe more. Sleeping on her horse blanket. Eating broth she'd made from scraps. Owing her his life. And somewhere out there, his people were looking for him, asking questions, offering money for information. The church bell fell silent. In the stillness that followed, Clara could hear her own heartbeat. How long before the truth came knocking at her door? To be continued. Day 5 began with the smell of trouble. Clara couldn't have said what woke her, maybe the way the light fell different through the shed's cracks, maybe the restlessness that had kept her tossing half the night. But when she opened her eyes to the gray of early morning, something in her bones told her the day wouldn't go easy. Ethan was still sleeping, his breathing steady now, his color better than it had been. The wound was healing clean, no red streaks, no smell of corruption. Another few days and he'd be fit to travel. Another few days, and this strange chapter of her life would close. Clara rose quietly, dressed in the dim light, checked the water bucket nearly empty. She'd need to fill it at the pump behind the livery, and she was out of salt, which meant a trip to the general store. She looked at the sleeping man one more time before she slipped out the door. Lord, she prayed silently, I don't know what you're doing with all this, but I reckon you've got your reasons. Help me trust the path, even when I can't see where it leads. The general store smelled of coffee beans and leather, and the particular mustiness of goods that had traveled far to reach this little town. Clara moved through the narrow aisles, past barrels of flour and bins of nails, toward the back where Mr. Dawson kept the salt. Morning light slanted through the front windows, catching dust motes that danced in the still air. 2 men stood at the counter, their voices carrying in the quiet. Been 5 days now. Samuel's got every hand out looking. From what I hear. Clara's feet slowed. She kept her eyes on the salt bin, but her ears strained toward the conversation. Caldwell. The second voice belonged to old Mr. Foster, who ran the feed store. Ethan Caldwell, Lord have mercy. The very same. Rode out to check the north pasture. Never came back. Horse turned up day before yesterday at Myers' place. Still saddled. Blood on the saddle blanket. Clara's hands went cold. She scooped salt into a small cloth bag, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. There's a reward, the first man continued. $20 for information, $50 if someone finds him alive. $50. Mr. Foster let out a low whistle. That's more than most folks see in a month of Sundays. Samuel's desperate, and that's the plain truth. They all are up at the Caldwell place. Man's got no kin, no heirs. If something's happened to him, that whole operation falls apart. All those jobs, all those families depending on it. Clara weighed her salt on the small scale. 3 cents worth. Her hands were steady, but something had started trembling deep inside her chest. She carried the bag to the counter, set it down, waited while Mr. Dawson finished his conversation. Miss Whitmore. He turned to her, adjusting his spectacles. Just the salt today. Yes, sir. She counted out 3 pennies, part of the 8 cents she had left to her name, slid them across the worn wood. You hear about Caldwell? Mr. Dawson asked as he wrapped her purchase in brown paper. Just now. Bits of it. Anyway. Terrible business. Good man. Caldwell. Fair employer. Pays his hands honest wages. Don't cheat on the weights at the cattle market. Neither. He shook his head slowly. World needs more men like that. I surely hope they find him. Yes, sir, Clara said. I hope so too. She took her salt and walked out into the morning sun, and her legs felt like they were moving through cold molasses. $50 reward. The whole county searching. And she'd been hiding him in her shed for 5 days, changing his bandages, feeding him broth, telling no one. If anyone found out, if anyone learned what she'd been keeping secret, Clara walked faster. She was halfway back to the livery when she saw the rider. A man on a bay gelding, coming from the north road, heading toward the back of the stables, gray hair showing under a dust-covered hat, weathered face, the kind that came from years of squinting into sun and wind, the look of someone who hadn't slept proper in days. He was heading straight for her shed. Clara broke into a run. The door stood open. She saw it from 20 feet away, morning light spilling into the darkness of her little shelter. The door she'd been so careful to keep closed now hanging wide. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crossed the last stretch of ground. She reached the doorway, stopped. 2 men inside. Ethan, sitting up against the wall, still pale but alert, and the gray-haired rider, hat clutched in both hands, standing in the middle of the small space like he didn't know whether to laugh or weep. Boss. The word came out cracked, broken with relief. We've been looking for 5 days. Thought we'd lost you. Clara's hand gripped the doorframe. Boss. Ethan's eyes found hers over the other man's shoulder. Something moved in his expression. Apology. Maybe. Or warning. She couldn't tell which. Samuel, Ethan said, his voice steady despite everything. This is Miss Whitmore. She's the reason I'm still drawing breath. The foreman turned. Clara got her first clear look at him 60 years if he was a day. With a face carved by decades of Texas sun and wind. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his clothes covered in trail dust. He'd been searching hard, living rough. Ma'am. His voice came out hoarse. He nodded once, then again, like he wasn't sure what the proper manners were for a situation like this. I don't know how to thank you. We thought... His voice broke. He pressed his lips together, gathered himself. We thought he was dead. He nearly was. The words came out flat. Clara stepped into the shed, her body moving on its own while her thoughts ran ahead like spooked horses. Samuel was here. Samuel knew, which meant soon everyone would know the search parties, the townspeople, the women who whispered about her outside the milliner's shop. The abandoned mail-order bride had been hiding Ethan Caldwell in her shed. Miss Whitmore, Ethan's voice cut through the fog in her head. Could you give us a minute? She looked at him, at the bandages she'd wrapped around his ribs with strips of her own petticoat, at the tin cup she'd kept filled with water. at the horse blanket that had been her bed before she gave it over to a dying stranger. Something hot rose in her chest. Anger, maybe, or something that felt like it. "Your minute," she said. "You're shed now, apparently." She walked out before he could answer. The mare was still tied behind the shed, right where Clara had been keeping her hidden. Clara had fed this horse, watered her, brushed her coat when she had time. The animal nickered softly as Clara approached, pushing her velvet nose against Clara's palm the way she did every morning now. "You're going home today, I reckon," Clara murmured. "Back to your fancy stable and your fancy oats." The mare snorted. Horses didn't care about money or pride, or the tangled mess that human beings made of their lives. Footsteps crunched on the dry grass behind her. Clara didn't turn. "He didn't mean to cause trouble, ma'am." Samuel's voice, rough and weary. "He's not that kind of man." "I know what kind of man he is." "Do you?" The foreman came to stand beside her, one weathered hand reaching out to stroke the mare's neck. 5 days ago, he rode out alone to check on a pasture because he didn't want to pull any of the boys away from branding. Does that himself. Always has. Says a man shouldn't ask his hands to do work he won't do his own self. Clara said nothing. Her fingers worked through the mare's mane, untangling knots she'd missed before. When his horse came back without him, "I thought—" Samuel's hand stilled on the horse's neck. 30 years I've worked for that man, watched him build that ranch up from nothing but dirt and determination. Watched him lose." He stopped, shook his gray head. "He should have told you who he was from the start. That wasn't right of him. But I'm asking you not to hold it against him too hard." "I'm not holding anything against anyone." Clara stepped back from the mare. "He needed help. I helped. That's the whole of it." "Is it?" She finally looked at Samuel straight on. His eyes were shrewd despite the exhaustion, studying her with a foreman's practiced measure the same way he probably judged horses and hired hands and weather. "He told me what you did," Samuel said quietly. "The medicine you bought with your last cents, the nights you sat up watching his fever, the wallet you found and didn't touch. He talks too much. First time in 30 years I'd accuse him of that, ma'am." A ghost of a smile crossed the old man's weathered face. "Miss Whitmore, I don't know your circumstances. It's not my business. And I won't pry. But I know my boss. And I know that look he gets in his eye. He won't forget what you did here. And Ethan Caldwell isn't a man who leaves debts unpaid." The shed door scraped open behind them. Both turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his face gray with the effort of standing. But his eyes were clear, and when they found Clara's across the dusty ground, they held steady. "We need to talk," he said, "about what happens next." To be continued. The wagon arrived within the hour. Samuel had ridden back toward the main road, flagged down a neighbor heading to town with an empty spring wagon, borrowed it with promises Clara couldn't hear from where she stood. Now the wagon sat behind the shed, its wooden bed lined with blankets Samuel had scrounged from somewhere, waiting to carry Ethan Caldwell back to his 12,000 acres. Clara watched the preparations from the doorway of her shed that didn't feel like hers anymore. Samuel moved with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his whole life getting things done, checking the harness, adjusting the blankets, testing the springs on the wagon seat. Inside, Ethan sat on the horse blanket, his face pale but his jaw set with determination. He'd insisted on dressing himself, though Clara had heard him grunt with pain when he pulled his torn shirt over his bandaged ribs. Stubborn man. She knew the type. Her father had been the same way, wouldn't ask for help if his hair was on fire. "Miss Whitmore." Ethan's voice came from behind her. She turned. He'd made it to his feet somehow, one hand braced against the wall, the other pressed to his side. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort. "You ought to be lying down," Clara said. "Probably." But we need to talk before I go. We've talked plenty. Not about this. He pushed off from the wall, took one unsteady step toward her, then another. Clara didn't move to help him. If he wanted to be stubborn, he could deal with the consequences. I need a housekeeper, he said, whatever she'd expected. It wasn't that. Beg pardon? A housekeeper. Someone to help run the house. Keep things organized. Mrs. Alma handles the cooking bin with me 15 years, but she's getting on in years. Can't manage everything on her own anymore. Clara crossed her arms over her chest. And what's that got to do with me? I'm offering you the position. $15 a month, room and board included. You'd have your own space, a real room, with a real bed and a door that locks. The words hung in the air between them. $15 a month. More than she'd made in 3 months of scrubbing other people's laundry. I'm not a charity case, Mr. Caldwell. Never said you were. You're offering me work because you feel beholden, because I pulled you out of that creek and didn't let you die. I'm offering you work because you're capable of doing it. Ethan's voice stayed level, but something flickered in his eyes. You kept me alive with nothing but yarrow and bone broth and sheer stubbornness. You can handle a house. Find someone else. There's plenty of women in this county who'd jump at the chance. I'm not asking plenty of women. I'm asking you. Clara's arms tightened across her chest. Outside, she could hear Samuel moving around the wagon, pretending to check things that didn't need checking. Why? The word came out sharper than she intended. You don't know me. You don't know the first thing about me except that I got left at a train station by a man who didn't exist. Ethan was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the corner of the shed, where his belongings sat bundled and ready, the fine wool coat, the saddlebag with its brass buckles. The watch, he said finally. Clara went still. That first night, when the fever had hold of me, I wasn't as far gone as you thought. He met her eyes. I saw you find my wallet, saw you count the money, and I saw you put it back. Every last dollar. Heat crept up Clara's neck. But it wasn't the money that told me who you are. It was the watch. He nodded toward the saddlebag. Gold. Worth $40. Maybe more. You could have slipped it in your pocket, sold it in the next town over, and I'd never have known the difference. The thought must have crossed your mind. Clara's jaw tightened. It didn't. I know. That's exactly my point. Ethan took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the lines of pain around his eyes. You didn't even consider it. Not because you were afraid of getting caught. Because it wasn't in you to do. The shed felt too small suddenly. The walls too close. Clara could smell the horse blanket and the dried blood and the particular scent of this man who'd turned her life sideways in the space of 5 days. The way I figure it, Ethan continued, the good Lord put you at that creek for a reason. Maybe it was to save my sorry hide. Maybe it was something more. He paused. Either way, I'm not the kind of man who ignores Providence when it comes knocking. Clara's eyes stung. She blinked hard, looked away. I'll send Samuel back in 2 days, Ethan said. Say yes or say no. Either way, the door will be open. Either way. I owe you a debt I can't repay with wages. You don't owe me anything. That's where you're wrong. Miss Whitmore. His voice softened. But I reckon you'll figure that out in your own time. They loaded him into the wagon with care. Clara helped despite herself, steadying his arm as Samuel took his weight, making sure the blankets were arranged so the jolting of the road wouldn't tear his stitches. Ethan bore it without complaint, though his face had gone gray by the time they got him settled. His things, Clara said. I'll fetch them. She returned to the shed, gathered the charcoal wool coat, brushed the dust from its shoulders, found the saddlebag with its brass buckles. The watch was inside, heavy and warm from the close air. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight in her palm. $40. He'd said, enough for a train ticket anywhere. Enough to start fresh in a city where nobody knew her name or her shame. The thought crossed her mind now, only now, when she no longer needed it to. Clara tucked the watch into the saddlebag, buckled the strap, carried it out to the wagon. "All of it," she said, handing it up to Samuel. "Every last thing." The old foreman took the bag. His eyes met hers for a long moment, and something passed between them, understanding. Maybe. Or respect. 2 days. Miss Whitmore. I'll be back. The wagon lurched into motion. Clara stood in the dust it raised, watching until it turned the corner past the livery and disappeared from sight. Then she walked back to her shed. Evening came slow and gray. Clara sat on her trunk as the light faded, watching shadows creep across the dirt floor. She didn't light the lamp. In the darkness, she could pretend she was somewhere else. Someone else. Someone who didn't have to choose between pride and survival. Her hand found its way to her apron pocket, past the empty space where coins used to be, past the cloth that still smelled faintly of salt. The marriage certificate. She unfolded it by feel. The paper so worn now it barely held together. In the dimness, she couldn't read the words, but she knew them by heart. Her careful signature, his confident scrawl, Harold J. Finch. A man made of ink and promises and nothing else. Clara sat with the paper in her hands for a long while. Outside, the sounds of Cedar Mill drifted through the cracks, supper fires crackling, children being called in from play, the lonesome whistle of a train passing through on its way to somewhere else. 2 roads, her grandmother used to say. Every choice in life comes down to 2 roads. One you know, and one you don't. The known road feels safer, but sometimes the unknown one is where the Lord wants you to walk. Clara folded the certificate smaller, tucked it back into her pocket, not ready to let go. Not yet. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she wasn't sure she wanted to hold on either. To be continued. 2 days later, Clara climbed into Samuel's wagon with her trunk beside her. Everything she owned fit in that trunk: 2 dresses worn soft from washing, 1 pair of spare stockings darned 3 times over, her mother's sewing kit with its bone needles and faded thread, a Bible with Grandmother Whitmore's name inscribed on the first page in ink that had faded to brown, and a marriage certificate, folded so small it had almost disappeared. The road north wound through limestone hills dotted with live oak and juniper. Cedar waxwings darted between the trees, their calls sharp and bright in the morning air. The smell of sage rose from the warming earth, mixing with the leather scent of the wagon seat and the particular dusty sweetness of a Texas autumn. Clara watched the landscape change, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight against the wooden seat. Samuel drove in companionable silence, and she was grateful for it. She didn't have words yet for what she was doing. Leaving, starting over, trusting a stranger for the second time in her life. The Lord doesn't ask us to see the whole road, her grandmother used to say. Just the next step. You take that one, and he shows you the one after. Clara was taking the step. She'd have to trust the Lord for the rest. The wagon crested a rise, and Samuel pulled the horses to a stop. "There she is," he said. "Caldwell Ranch." Clara looked. The house stood white against the green hills. 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like arms waiting to embrace. Glass windows, real glass, not oiled paper, caught the afternoon sun and threw it back at the sky. A red-painted barn sat to the left, solid and proud. Corrals fanned out behind it. And beyond them, pastures rolled toward the horizon, dotted with live oak and grazing cattle. 12,000 acres. The number had been words before. Now it pressed against her chest, heavy and real. She thought of the shed behind the livery, the cracked mirror, the horse blanket on the dirt floor. "Ready?" Samuel asked. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "Drive on." Ethan met her on the porch steps. He was walking with a cane now, his movements careful but steady. Color had come back to his face, not healthy yet, but better than the gray pallor she remembered from the shed. He wore a clean shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and when he saw her step down from the wagon, something shifted in his expression. "You came." "I said I would." "You said you'd think on it." Clara looked at the house, at the glass windows and the wide porch and the rocking chairs arranged to catch the evening breeze. "I thought on it." Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the front door. "Welcome to Caldwell Ranch, Miss Whitmore. Let me show you around." The house smelled of lemon oil and wood smoke and something baking in the kitchen. Clara followed Ethan through the front door, her worn boots quiet on the polished wooden floors. A parlor opened to the left, leather chairs softened by years of use. A fireplace swept clean, bookshelves lined with more volumes than Clara had seen outside of a lending library. "Dining rooms through there," Ethan said, nodding to the right. A long table of dark wood waited there, dust motes drifting in the light from the windows. 8 chairs stood empty around it. Clara wondered when anyone had last sat in them. "Kitchen's at the back. That's Mrs. Alma's territory, and I'd advise you to tread careful until she takes your measure." Ethan's voice held a note of dry humor. "She's been running this household since before I could grow a proper beard, and she doesn't suffer fools." They walked down a hallway lined with photographs, men on horseback, cattle drives, a wedding portrait in a silver frame. Clara's eyes lingered on that last one. A young man with dark hair stood beside a woman with serious eyes. Ethan and his Sarah, before time and grief had carved their marks. "Your room's upstairs," Ethan continued. "End of the hall, small, but it's got a good bed and a window that catches the morning light." He led her up a staircase with a polished banister. Clara's hand trailed along the smooth wood, feeling the years of hands that had touched it before hers. The room was small, like he'd said, but it had a real bed with a cotton mattress and a quilt folded at the foot, blue and white, a pattern her grandmother would have called wedding ring. A washstand stood in the corner with a pitcher and basin. And the window had curtains, simple muslin, but curtains she could close, a door that locked. Clara stood in the doorway, her trunk at her feet, and looked at the space that was now hers. "It's not much," Ethan said from behind her. "It's more than I've had in a good long while." She stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under her weight. A friendly sound, like the house was saying hello. "Supper's at 6, Ethan said. "Mrs. Alma will want to meet you proper. Get yourself settled, and I'll see you then." His footsteps retreated down the hallway. Clara listened until they faded, then closed the door, turned the lock. The click echoed in the quiet room. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave beneath her soft, impossibly soft after weeks on a horse blanket and hard ground. She pressed her palms against the quilt, feeling the tiny stitches, the pattern of interlocking circles. Someone had made this. Someone had sat for hours, needle in hand, creating something beautiful and warm. And now it was hers to use. Clara lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling, listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the tick of cooling wood, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the lowing of cattle far away. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to be anywhere, didn't have to work for anyone, didn't have to worry about the next meal or the next day's wages. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and slept. The smell of biscuits woke her. Clara's eyes opened to lamplight and shadows. She'd slept through the afternoon. The window showed purple sky and the first stars emerging over the hills. She sat up fast. "Supper at 6, he'd said. What time was it now? Clara splashed water on her face from the basin, smoothed her hair back. brushed the wrinkles from her dress as best she could. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a woman with tired eyes, but a determined jaw. "You can do this," she told herself. "You've done harder things." She went downstairs. The kitchen was warm with the smell of things Clara had almost forgotten. Fresh bread and roasting meat and coffee percolating in a pot on the back of the stove. A woman stood at the counter, her back to the door, hands working a bowl of something with practiced movements. Gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, shoulders squared like a soldier's. An apron that had seen years of use and showed every one of them. "You're late." The voice was sharp, but not unkind. "Supper's been ready 10 minutes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I fell asleep. The bed was—" Clara stopped, suddenly embarrassed. "I'm not used to beds like that." The woman turned. Mrs. Alma had a face that looked like it had been carved from oak, all angles and planes, weathered by time and trouble. Her eyes were gray as storm clouds, and they traveled over Clara with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime taking the measure of people. "You're the one who kept him breathing." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Alma wiped her hands on her apron, nodded toward the table in the corner of the kitchen, a smaller one than the grand dining table. Scarred by years of use, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. "Sit." Clara hesitated. "I can help serve. If you need—" "I said sit." Clara sat. Mrs. Alma moved to the stove, ladled stew from a cast iron pot into a deep bowl, a full portion, not the servant's scraps Clara had half expected. Added a biscuit from the oven, golden brown and steaming. Set the bowl in front of Clara with a thunk that rattled the spoon. "Anyone who hauls Mr. Caldwell out of a creek and keeps him alive for 5 days on bone broth and yarrow earns a seat at my table." Mrs. Alma's voice was gruff, but something softer moved behind those storm-gray eyes. "Now eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal since Methuselah was a boy." Clara picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled. The first bite hit her tongue beef and potatoes and onions, seasoned with herbs she couldn't name, rich and hot, and more flavorful than anything she'd eaten in months. Her eyes stung. She ate slowly, deliberately. If she ate too fast, she would cry, and she wasn't about to cry in front of this woman who watched her with those knowing eyes. Mrs. Alma poured coffee into a tin cup, set it beside Clara's bowl, then sat down across from her with her own cup, saying nothing, just being present while Clara ate. When the bowl was empty, Mrs. Alma refilled it without being asked. "Thank you," Clara managed. "Don't thank me. Thank the Lord and the cow that gave its life." Mrs. Alma's voice was dry. "You can earn your keep starting tomorrow. The pantry's a disaster. The linens haven't been properly sorted in a year, and I'm too old to be climbing ladders to dust the high shelves." "Yes, ma'am." "And it's Alma. Just Alma. I'm too old for all that ma'am business, too." Something loosened in Clara's chest. She nodded. "You'll do," Alma said. "I reckon you'll do just fine." The first week passed in a blur of work. Clara threw herself into it the way she'd thrown herself into every job she'd ever had, wholly, completely, like her life depended on it. Because maybe it did. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in months, beating rugs until her arms ached, scrubbing floors until the wood gleamed like new copper. She sorted linens, mended curtains, organized the pantry until Alma could find things without having to dig through 3 shelves of unlabeled jars. The house had been maintained, but not loved. Clara could see it in the corners where dust had gathered, in the windows that hadn't been washed since spring, in the dining room that sat empty meal after meal. She set about changing that. On the 4th day, Alma found her elbow deep in the root cellar, sorting potatoes from onions from turnips. "You know how to bone a chicken?" Alma asked without preamble. Clara looked up. "Taught myself when I was 12. My mother took sick one winter. Someone had to feed the family." Alma nodded slowly. Something shifted in her expression, not approval exactly, but something close to it. "Dinner's at 6. I'll show you where we keep the knives. On the seventh evening, Clara found Ethan on the front porch. He sat in one of the rocking chairs, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sun drop toward the western hills. The light turned his face gold and amber, softening the lines around his eyes. His cane leaned against the porch railing, within easy reach. A second cup sat on the small table beside him. Steam curled up from it into the cooling air. Clara stopped at the door. I didn't mean to interrupt your quiet. You're not... Ethan nodded toward the empty chair. Sit, please. Alma said you've been working yourself to the bone all week. You've earned a rest. She hesitated, then crossed the porch, lowered herself into the rocker. The wood creaked beneath her weight, a comfortable sound, like the chairs remembered being sat in. The coffee was hot and strong, bitter the way she liked it. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, let the warmth seep into her work-sore fingers. They sat in silence for a while. The sun sank lower, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang its evening song 3 notes, repeated, then 3 more. You've made a difference, Ethan said finally. The house feels different. Alma noticed it too. It just needed some attention. Most things do. He took a sip of his coffee. People too, I reckon. The mockingbird sang again. Clara watched a line of cattle moving across the far pasture, dark shapes against the golden grass. Can I ask you something? Ethan's voice was quiet. Depends on what it is. The photograph in my wallet. The woman with the gray hair. You saw it. That first night. Clara's hands tightened on her cup. I figured she was your mother. My wife. The word came out steady, but something underneath it wasn't. Sarah. She passed on 8 years ago come spring. Fever took her. Same fever that almost took me when I was a boy. Funny how the Lord works sometimes. Clara thought of the name he'd called in his delirium. Sarah. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We were married 11 years. Ethan continued. I built this ranch for her. Every room, every fence post, every acre. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could give her everything she deserved. He paused. She died 3 months after we finished the house. The mockingbird fell silent. The only sounds were the creak of the rockers and the distant lowing of cattle. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. It was a long time ago. 8 years now. She's been gone longer than we were married. Ethan looked at his coffee cup like he could read something in its depths. Some nights I walk through this house and wonder who I built it for. All these rooms, all this space, and just me rattling around in it like a marble in a barrel. Clara stared at the horizon. The sun had touched the hills now, spilling red across the sky. Maybe, she said slowly, you'll figure that out. What it was all for. She didn't look at him when she said it. He didn't look away from her. The silence stretched between them, full of things neither was ready to say. Clara finished her coffee, set the cup on the table, rose from the chair. Good night, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan. She paused at the door. Good night, Ethan. She went inside, climbed the stairs, locked herself in her room, stood at the window, looking out at the darkening land, her hand resting on the glass. 8 years. He'd been alone in this house for 8 years, carrying a photograph and a memory. Clara reached into her apron pocket, found the folded paper that had lived there for a month. Harold J. Finch. A name, a lie, a wound that hadn't healed. She looked at the marriage certificate in the dying light, looked at the land beyond her window, looked at the quilt on the bed and the door with its lock and the life that might be waiting if she was brave enough to reach for it. 8 years was a long time to carry the dead. Maybe it was time to let them go. To be continued, said. 3 months changed everything and nothing. The hill country had turned gold and rust with October, the sycamores and cottonwoods blazing color, while the live oaks held their stubborn green. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the gray light of early morning, watching mist rise from the pastures, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Behind her, Alma hummed an old hymn while she kneaded bread dough, Amazing Grace. The same tune Clara's grandmother used to hum over her washboard back in Pennsylvania. The sound had become part of the rhythm of Clara's days, along with the creak of the porch boards at dawn and the distant lowing of cattle and the particular way the house settled into quiet after supper. "You're thinking too loud," Alma said without turning around. Her hands never stopped their work press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn. "I can hear it all the way over here." Clara smiled into her coffee. "Just watching the morning come in." Alma's voice was dry. "That why you've been staring at that same patch of pasture for 10 minutes? Maybe. He's been asking about you, every morning at breakfast. Where you are, what you're doing, whether you've eaten." Clara's fingers tightened on the cup. "He asks about everyone." "He doesn't ask about everyone the way he asks about you." Alma turned, her gray eyes sharp as always, but something gentler underneath. "I've known that man 30 years. Child. Watched him court Sarah. Watched him mourn her. I know what it looks like when Ethan Caldwell's heart starts beating for something besides cattle and fence posts." Clara set her cup in the basin, tied her apron tighter. "I've got work to do." "That you do." Alma went back to her bread. "That you do." The house had transformed in 3 months. Clara walked through it now with the ease of someone who belonged, though she still caught herself sometimes. Stopping in doorways, marveling at how far she'd come from that shed behind the livery. The parlor windows gleamed from her washing. The dining room table shone with fresh polish, and Clara had taken to putting wildflowers in a jar at its center, late-blooming asters now, purple and white, gathered from the meadow behind the barn. She'd mended the curtains in Ethan's study, organized his bookshelves by subject, found a photograph of his parents buried in a desk drawer, and cleaned the frame and hung it in the hallway where the morning light could catch it. Small changes, but they added up to something that felt like home. The front door opened. Bootsteps in the hallway. "Clara," Ethan's voice. She set down the feather duster, smoothed her apron. "In the parlor." He appeared in the doorway. He'd stopped using the cane weeks ago, though he still moved careful when the weather turned wet and his old wound ached. The scar along his ribs had faded to a thin white line. She'd seen it once, accidentally, when she'd walked into the kitchen while he was washing up at the pump. "Walk with me," he asked. Something in his voice made her look twice. He stood straight enough, but his hands hung at his sides in a way that wasn't quite easy, like he was bracing for something. "Now, if you've got time." Clara glanced at the clock on the mantel. "Let me fetch my shawl." They walked through the autumn afternoon in easy silence. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the hills in shades of amber and rose. Their boots crunched on the packed dirt path that led past the barn, past the corrals where horses dozed in the fading warmth, toward the creek that wound through the north pasture. Clara knew where they were going before they arrived. Cypress Creek looked different in autumn. The feverfew had gone to seed, white flowers replaced by brown stalks rattling in the breeze. The water ran lower than it had in September, exposing the limestone shelves where Ethan had fallen 3 months ago. He stopped at the bank, stood quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "Right here," he said finally. "This is where you found me. I remember. You could have left me. Nobody would have known different. Nobody would have blamed you. We've been over this ground before. I know, but I keep coming back to it." He turned to face her. The setting sun caught his features, painting them gold and shadow. 3 months I've had to think on it. 3 months of watching you work, watching you turn this house into something it hasn't been since Sarah passed. He paused. Watching you become part of something I thought was finished. Clara's heart had started beating faster. She kept her face still, the way she'd learned to do when she was afraid of hoping. Alma says you've made this place a home. Ethan's voice dropped. First time she's used that word in 8 years. Alma's kind. Alma's honest. That's different. He took a breath. Clara, I'm not a man who's good with words. Never have been. Sarah used to laugh at me for it said I could count cattle in my sleep but couldn't put together a proper sentence when it mattered. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass. The creek murmured over its stones. But I know what I've seen these 3 months. Ethan continued. I know what it feels like to come home to a house with flowers on the table and light in the windows. I know what it means to sit on that porch in the evening and not feel like the only person left in the world. He reached into his coat pocket. Clara's breath stopped. His hand came out holding a ring. Plain gold. No stones. Simple and honest. Catching the last of the sunlight. This was my mother's, Ethan said. His voice wasn't steady now. Neither was his hand. She gave it to me before she passed. Said I'd know when the time was right to give it to someone else. I've been carrying it in that drawer for 15 years. Waiting. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around the words. I'm not asking you to forget what brought you here. That man who lied to you, what he did was wrong. And I can't fix it. Can't undo the hurt. Ethan took a step closer. But I can offer you something true. A place that's yours. A life that's real. And a man who'll spend whatever years he's got left trying to deserve you. The meadowlark sang again. The creek kept its quiet conversation with the stones. I know I'm old, Ethan said. 38 years and more wear than I'd like to admit. I know I'm not what you dreamed of when you got on that train in Pennsylvania, but I'm asking anyway. He held out the ring. Stay, not as my housekeeper, as my wife. Clara looked at the ring, looked at the man holding it, looked at the creek where everything had started, 3 months ago, when she'd been a woman with nothing but a handful of coins and a worthless piece of paper. You're sure? Her voice came out rough, scraped raw with something she couldn't name. I come with baggage. Ethan, a whole trunk of it. So do I. That ghost of a smile crossed his face, the one she'd come to know these past months. Reckon we can carry it together. She reached for the ring. Her fingers trembled as they brushed his warm. Calloused, steady, in a way hers weren't. The band slid onto her finger, fit like it had been waiting for her all along. I suppose, Clara said, and her voice only shook a little. I'll have to stop calling you Mr. Caldwell. Ethan laughed, a real laugh. The first she'd heard from him, full and warm and surprised, like he'd forgotten he knew how. I suppose you will. They walked back to the house as the stars came out. The first frost of the season was coming. Clara could smell it in the air. That particular sharpness that meant winter wasn't far behind. But for now, the evening was mild, and the man beside her was warm, and the ring on her finger caught the lamplight from the kitchen window as they climbed the porch steps. I should tell Alma, Ethan said. She already knows. Clara smiled. She's been waiting for you to work up the nerve since September. That obvious, was it? Only to everyone but me. Apparently. He took her hand, held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the band of gold. Thank you, he said quietly. For saying yes. For everything. Clara squeezed his fingers. Thank me in the morning, when you've had time to realize what you've gotten yourself into. She went inside before he could answer. climbed the stairs to her room, in this house that was becoming hers, closed the door and stood in the darkness, her hand pressed over her heart. The ring was warm against her finger. Real. Solid. True. Later, after the house had gone quiet, Clara lit her lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed, the golden light pooling around her. Reached into the drawer of her nightstand, where she'd kept it hidden these 3 months. The marriage certificate. She unfolded it slowly, carefully. The paper was so worn now, it threatened to fall apart along its creases. Harold J. Finch's signature stared up at her, that confident scrawl she'd once believed in with her whole heart. 6 months of letters. $40 for a train ticket. A promise that turned to smoke the moment she'd needed it to be real. Clara looked at the paper for a long moment. At the signature of a man who might never have existed. At the dream it had represented a home, a future, a place where she belonged. She'd carried this wound across 1,000 miles, nursed it through weeks of scrubbing floors and begging scraps. Let it whisper in her ear every night that she wasn't worth staying for, wasn't worth coming for, wasn't worth the ink it took to write her name. No more. Clara rose from the bed, crossed to the small stove in the corner of her room, opened the iron door. The coals glowed orange inside, banked for the night but still breathing. She struck a match, held the flame to the corner of the certificate. The paper caught. Fire licked up the edges, consuming Harold J. Finch's signature, consuming the county seal, consuming every lie and broken promise she'd carried from Pennsylvania. Clara watched it burn. The flames turned the paper brown, then black, then ash. It curled in on itself and crumbled, falling into the coals like it had never existed at all. She closed the stove door, stood there in the quiet room, her hand on the warm iron, and breathed. "The Lord doesn't waste pain," her mother used to say. "Every hard thing we go through, He uses to make us ready for what comes next." Clara finally understood what that meant. Dawn came soft and gold through the muslin curtains. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. She lay still for a moment, watching the light move across the ceiling, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger. Real. Still real. She rose, washed her face, put on her good dress, the blue calico, mended but clean, looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she almost didn't recognize. Not the abandoned bride, not the woman nobody wanted, just Clara. Clara Whitmore, soon to be Clara Caldwell. She went downstairs. The kitchen was warm with the smell of biscuits and bacon. Alma stood at the stove, but she turned when Clara entered, and something in her weathered face softened. "About time," was all she said, but she pulled Clara into a hug, brief, fierce, unexpected. About time that man came to his senses. Clara hugged her back. "Thank you for everything. Don't thank me. Thank the Lord in your own good heart." Alma stepped back, wiping her eyes with her apron. "Now go on." "He's on the porch, waiting. Been there since first light. Too excited to eat. Like a boy at Christmas." Clara walked through the house, past the parlor with its polished windows, past the dining room with its wildflowers, past the photographs in the hallway, Sarah's face among them, watching with those serious eyes. "I'll take care of him," Clara thought. "I promise." She stepped onto the porch. Ethan sat in his rocking chair, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the sun rise over the eastern hills. The light caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, a face that had known sorrow and come through to the other side. He looked up when he heard her, smiled. "Mornin'. Morning." He nodded to the chair beside him. The second cup of coffee was already waiting, steam rising in the cool air. Clara sat down, wrapped her hands around the warm cup. looked out at the land stretching toward the horizon, the pastures and the hills and the cattle moving through the morning mist. Her land now, her home, her life. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold. The mockingbird in the live oak sang its three-note song. The cattle lowed in the distance. Somewhere in the kitchen, Alma was singing that old hymn again. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. Ethan reached over, took Clara's hand, held it like something precious. "Welcome home," he said. Clara smiled, squeezed his fingers, watched the light spread across the land. Home. Finally. Home. The end. Word count 2180, a final word. If you've walked this far beside Clara and Ethan, I thank you kindly for the company. Stories like these remind me of the tales my grandmother used to tell on her front porch, back when summer evenings lasted forever and fireflies danced in the mason jars we'd catch them in. She always said the best stories weren't about the big moments, they were about the quiet ones. The cup of coffee shared at dawn. The hand reached across a table. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. I wrote this story thinking of folks like her. Folks who understood that kindness costs nothing but can mean everything. That second chances are worth reaching for. That home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you finally stop running. May your coffee always be warm. And may someone, somewhere, see the truth of you and choose to stay. Until next time, friends. Disclaimer. This work draws inspiration from classic Western romance and mail-order bride narratives, created solely for entertainment purposes. This story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, names, places, and events depicted herein are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to actual events is purely coincidental and unintentional. The end.